Good afternoon from the US East Coast. I am Rudabeh Shahid, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. As many of you are aware, after a military coup in February 2021, that is last year, Myanmar relapsed into a military dictatorship after more than a decade-long hiatus and experimentation with democracy. The group that suffered the most under more than half a century of military rule is the Rohingyas, an ethnic minority in Myanmar's Rakhine state. Myanmar revoked their citizenship in 1982 and essentially made the Rohingyas stateless. The decade-long social and political exclusion transformed into genocidal violence in August 2017, when more than 800,000 Rohingyas fled to neighboring Bangladesh, and the UN described this episode as a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. I am joined today by Dr. Ronan Lee, author of Myanmar's Rohingya Genocide, Identity, History, and Hate Speech. Dr. Lee has a professional background in politics, media, and public policy. He was formerly a Queensland State Member of Parliament between 2001 to 2009 in Australia, and served on the front bench as a parliamentary secretary from 2006 to 2008 in portfolios including justice, main roads, and local government. He has also worked as a senior government advisor and as an election strategist and campaign manager. He is currently a doctoral prize fellow at Loughborough University, London's Institute for Media and Creative Industries, where his research focuses on the Rohingyas, genocide, hate speech, migration, and wider Asian politics. Dr. Lee's book, which was banned in May of this year in Myanmar, titled Myanmar's Rohingya Genocide, Identity, History, and Hate Speech, sheds light on the Rohingya identity, history, and culture, contributing significantly to the study of the Rohingya people and the different stages of genocide experienced by the community. To bolster our understanding of the dynamics of the genocide, we are joined by Dr. Lee, who draws on thousands of hours of interviews and testimonies from the Rohingyas themselves to assess and outline the full stage of the disaster. So welcome, Dr. Lee, and thank you for being here.
Great to be with you.
So first of all, Dr. Lee, we would like to know, how did you come to study this topic, and what kind of challenges have you faced while doing your fieldwork?
Well, I came to do research with the Rohingya through my work on Myanmar. I was a specialist in politics, and I was focused on Myanmar politics. And it became just very clear that from a scholarly perspective, there was a lack of solid work that was been done looking at the Rohingya's history. And there was a lack of work that was been done. Publications were lacking in terms of mapping the genocide against the Rohingya. And I thought that it was important to contribute my time to do that. In terms of the challenges, access was a huge challenge. And that was something that was a marker of the genocide against the Rohingya. I mean, what military dictatorships like we saw in Myanmar always try to do is they always try to cover up their crimes. They don't want the outside world to know what's going on. So they really limited the access that was available to the places where the Rohingya victims were. So you could, for a period of time, of course, you could visit Myanmar. You were able to do academic research within Myanmar. But as soon as you tried to do research that involved talking to Rohingya in the camps that they were confined to, or in their villages that they were confined to, that became much more difficult. And while the authorities never explicitly said you can't do that type of research or we don't want people going there, they just made it very difficult for people to be able to do that. So of course, that affects scholarship. That means that scholars aren't able to talk to Rohingya victims, and it would have affected journalism too. And it certainly affected the Rohingyas' ability over many years to tell their story to the outside world. And I think what we saw from 2017, after the genocide or forced deportation from Myanmar to Bangladesh, where most Rohingya are now living, I think from that time we saw the Rohingya actually much more able to tell their stories and to give their accounts of what had happened to them to the outside world, because the Bangladesh authorities were not trying to cover up genocide. They were not trying to prevent the Rohingya from talking about their history. So that's been a change that we've seen in the last few years. But the situation remains the same for Rohingya within Myanmar, that they're both inaccessible for journalists and scholars and even humanitarian workers, and also they can't get out of their communities. They can't travel freely. They can't leave Rakhine State where they're trapped.
Thank you so much for giving us that overview. And in your book, which I have had the pleasure of reading, you talk about your fieldwork experience and your visits to Myanmar. So can you tell us a little bit about some interesting interviews and testimonies from the Rohingyas? And how were you able to obtain testimonies from this persecuted minority group? Also, do you think that their extreme persecution was heading to a genocide at one point in time?
Well, the thing was, they want to talk to the outside world. So they want their story. Certainly the Rohingya who I interacted with, they wanted their stories. They wanted accounts of what had happened to them to be made available to the outside world. I mean, their belief was that if people knew what was going on, then the international community would step in to stop it. So they were incredibly gracious and very kind in terms of sharing their stories with me. I mean, I break my research into two parts. Before the 2017 deportation and afterwards. And before that, I mean, this is when most of the world really wasn't familiar with what was going on for the Rohingya. The Rohingya had by that stage been transitioned from being full members of Myanmar society, so able to vote and be elected to parliament and hold jobs like doctors and lawyers and teachers, and just been by the 21st century, their whole situation had been changed. They were effectively stateless. They were living within an apartheid state, so restrictions on their access to healthcare and education. They couldn't travel, so they weren't allowed to move freely from even one village to the next village. So their situation was pretty dire at that point. There were 100,000 plus, so around between 120 and 140,000 Rohingya stuck, confined to camps on the outskirts of Rakhine State's biggest urban centre, Sitwe. I mean, these are concentration camps. These are civilians. These are not militants or anything like that. These are just ordinary people. But their crime is that they're Rohingya. So they're confined to concentration camps. Those who were stuck in urban centres like Sitwe, I mean, there's a ghetto within the middle of Sitwe where Rohingya are trapped. They're surrounded by armed guard. I mean, they can't freely leave. They can't go to the market. They can't readily access the hospital, which is very nearby, or anything like that. It was pretty dire circumstances even then. And the stories that they wanted to tell the world, well, what was going on for them? I mean, what they wanted us to know what their life was like. And Rohingya, particularly older Rohingya, who had a lived experience, have been a full part of Myanmar society, were astounded by what had happened to them and to their community. They really struggled that a country that they'd been very loyal to, a country that is, I mean, this is their ancestral home, and a country that they were proud to be part of, had treated them in this terrible way, restricting their rights in a way that was certainly genocidal. It was pretty obvious, I think, from those visits, so prior to 2017, that the circumstances of the Rohingya were genocide. I mean, what was missing, maybe, in terms of the international community considering it genocide, was mass killing. I mean, but that's not a requirement under the Genocide Convention. To describe a situation as genocide, but that was not quite there to the extent that the international community would have regarded there to be a need for mass killing. But that came in 2017. The military of Myanmar rampaged through Rohingya communities at that time, destroying them wholesale. Myanmar's military, when it undertakes what they call clearance operations, these are scorched earth campaigns, and by their nature they target civilians. So they often present these things to the outside world, and we're seeing them now since the coup. We're seeing these things happening in the Buddhist heartland of Myanmar, where the military is undertaking clearance operations, and they present that as some sort of almost a surgical military engagement, but that's not what it is. It's scorched earth. And by its nature, clearance operations target civilians. And that's what was done to the Rohingya in 2017. Hundreds of Rohingya villages destroyed wholesale. I mean, the destruction was so horrible and so widespread. You can see it in satellite images. Human Rights Watch, I think, released footage at the time where you can clearly see in the satellite images the damage that's been done to Rohingya communities. Now, the military's tactic afterwards was to reform those communities so that it's unclear Rohingya had ever lived there. So they bulldozed the destroyed homes, or they let nature regrow over things, so that even if the Rohingya do return, they would struggle to quite recognize their community or their village as the one that they had left. And that's another marker of genocide. That's the symbolic reenactment that genocide scholars talk about as the final stage of genocide. It's the genocide perpetrator trying to pretend that the victim group had never actually legitimately lived in the place. And it's another genocide tactic. But look, it was very clear from even before 2017 that the crimes against the Rohingya amounted to genocide. This is a community that's been actively, its access to education has been actively undermined. Its access to healthcare has been undermined. Really tight restrictions on Rohingya, their ability to marry or have children. So requirements to pay fines or bribes to government officials to be able to marry or have children. And this is important because it allows you to be listed in official documents. So if they don't pay the bribe or don't pay the fine, then the child or the marriage doesn't get officially registered, and that creates problems down the track. And this was pretty widespread, and of course restrictions on Rohingya ability to travel, and this had an effect outside of their ancestral lands. I mean, this had an effect in the rest of Myanmar, where many people in the other parts of Myanmar just simply had never met a Rohingya. They didn't know who the Rohingya really were. They knew it was. They might have known it was a group that lives in Rakhine State, adjacent to Bangladesh, but it had been by the 21st century. It had been it could have been decades since there were obvious Rohingya communities in other parts of Myanmar. And that, of course, enabled crimes against the Rohingya. It enabled the military and others to portray the Rohingya as foreigners. They're able to say, well, look, you've never met these people. They must be foreigners, so they're not legitimately part of our national political fabric. So don't worry about them. It also gave power to the hate speech that we saw in Myanmar, particularly since the liberalizations to the telecommunications industry in about 2012, because of course people didn't have a lived experience of knowing a Rohingya because of the travel restrictions. So it was very clear. I mean, these are pretty standard genocide tactics. I mean, these are things that would be recognized from other genocide contexts. And it was almost textbook examples within Myanmar of a genocide. And of course, then in 2017, a large-scale forced deportation. So the removal of most Rohingya from Myanmar. And that's a genocidal act in and of itself. It's an attempt to remove, to erase a victim group from the national political fabric and from the nation.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, for pointing out certain disturbing but very important facts that probably the international community missed or chose to overlook at that point in time. Now at the South Asia Center, we have questions about regional actors. So what can and should have regional actors such as India and other South Asian SAARC countries have done to support the Rohingyas? So Bangladesh has become the host to 1.1 million Rohingya refugees, while India, some would say, have abandoned the Rohingyas, where in some instances, some members of the Rohingya community have been forcefully deported to Myanmar, where, of course, they face a genocide. Why is this the case?
Well, I think my criticism of most international actors is lack of engagement. And a lack of engagement has given license to Myanmar's military to continue the sorts of crimes that they committed against the Rohingya in other parts of Myanmar. So I'd contend that the international community's inaction when the Rohingya was being dreadfully treated within Myanmar, that enabled the 2017 forced deportation. And the international community's inaction when that occurred, its refusal to engage with, to in fact prevent Myanmar's military from doing that, I think empowered and emboldened Myanmar's military, and that's why we saw the coup. I think had there been stronger action internationally and by key domestic political actors, I mean, there was a quasi-civilian administration in Myanmar as well that I think could have restrained the military in 2017 and chose for its own reasons not to do that. But had those efforts to restrain the military been done in 2017, I don't quite think we'd have seen the coup that we saw in 2021. What's occurred is that at no point has anyone really drawn a line and said to the military, this is too much. Now that's occurred since the coup. Within Myanmar, there is resistance to the military's coup, but prior to that, there were many opportunities to draw a line and demand restraint from the military, and that didn't occur. I've got to say, Bangladesh very graciously opened its doors to 1 million Rohingya refugees, and as much as there is criticism of how that has been managed now, some years on, that is a substantial humanitarian commitment on the part of Bangladesh. That should be acknowledged. I mean, Bangladesh is not a rich country. Bangladesh is a country that struggles with its own its own poverty within its own community. It did a pretty decent job to be as welcoming as it was in 2017. However, India is a bit different. In India, I think, has its own domestic politics, and I think the Rohingya have been used as pawns within that. The Rohingya community within India is very small. maybe 50,000 Rohingya, maybe more, maybe less, but it's not on the whole, it's not a huge community, but they've become a symbol for Muslim migration into India, and that's a problem for the Rohingya. They're a higher profile group within India than their numbers should lead them to be, and that, I think, has created a political problem hazard for the Rohingya, that they've been used by particularly by Hindu nationalists within India as a symbol of unrestrained Muslim migration into India, and that's a problem. That's going to be a huge humanitarian problem for the Rohingya. Some of the government's actions in terms of arresting Rohingya and returning them to genocidal conditions within Myanmar, which India's government has done, are inexcusable. I mean, it's under international law. You just simply shouldn't be sending people back to face the same genocide crimes that they fled. In terms of the broader geopolitics of what we're seeing within Myanmar, and the Rohingya's example, I think, becomes a part of that. I think what we're seeing within Myanmar is, I mean, 2017, it was the Trump administration that was in power, and there was no interest on the part of President Trump in terms of engaging with what was going on in Myanmar. There was a meeting, in fact, in the White House, I think it was, where he made some comments that suggested he didn't quite know who the Rohingya were, where they were from. I mean, this was while this was huge news internationally, but that symbolized, I think, a level of disengagement by that administration that's changed somewhat, and I would say quite considerably changed since the Biden administration came to office. We've seen very strong statements by the Biden administration. They've declared the mistreatment of the Rohingya as genocide, and it's one of the few genocide declarations the US has ever made, which is an important symbolic step. The US has definitely taken some steps to ensure there are targeted sanctions that focus on Myanmar's military, but that's not enough. And it's not enough because there's not a global arms embargo. There's no effort really at the UN to enforce an arms embargo. There seems to be a fear that China or Russia might veto that sort of action, and to avoid the embarrassment of being vetoed by China or Russia, that there seems to be a lack of will on the part of the other permanent members of the Security Council, the US, the UK, and France, to really push for an arms embargo. I mean, it really is shocking that Myanmar's military, after what they've done to the Rohingya and after the coup that they undertook in 2021, can still buy bullets, and they can still bullets that they're using on their own people now. In many respects, what we're seeing within Myanmar is, I think, a reflection of Chinese political and economic hegemony in that region. And this is something that I think will play out in the coming years. I mean, China's view is that it's happy to give. I mean, when the coup occurred in 2021, China, for a brief period of time, indicated that it wasn't happy with the coup, and there seemed to be, they had a very positive relationship with Aung San Suu Kyi's government. There seemed to be some indication that the Chinese government would not support the Myanmar military in post-coup. That's changed now. It changed very quickly. The Chinese government supports the military now in Myanmar, and they are, in fact, the military's biggest arms supplier. But how that's playing out within Myanmar is a catastrophe. The country's virtually ungovernable. 13 million people described by or identified by the UN as in urgent need of I mean, food insecurity is how the UN, that's usually how they portray it, but I mean, it's a euphemism for saying people will starve. I mean, this is incredibly serious in a country of, what, 55 million people? And I think that this says something about what happens when you let a local hegemon who does not have an interest in domestic politics. I mean, China's view is that they don't interfere in they don't interfere within sovereign states. But the consequence of that is that they kind of do. I mean, they're happy to sell them. They're happy to sell the military weapons. So they are interfering, but they're interfering to provide the weapons, but they're not interfering to fix the problems that have been created. And I think that that's a significant issue for not just Myanmar, but could well be seen. We could well see this pattern played out in other parts of the world. And that will be, I think, a significant concern for particularly US policymakers when they consider their engagement with China. I think in terms of the role of ASEAN has been almost tasked with been the regional body that manages and transitions Myanmar post-coup or through the coup. It's just not able to do that. ASEAN's incredibly divided. In fact, on the issue of Myanmar, ASEAN's pretty much divided into two camps: those that are happy to just roll along with military rule, and those, Indonesia, Malaysia, I think the Philippines, who are, to a lesser extent, maybe Singapore, who are not happy with that and who feel that what's going on within Myanmar is a significant concern. But really, ASEAN's paralysed and is not, I mean, I would say not fit for purpose in terms of what it's been tasked with doing. It's not a body that would consider its key role dealing with security issues within any of its member states. Yet key international actors, the UN, the US, UK and others, have been happy to leave action on Myanmar with ASEAN, and that's a problem. So to summarize, the problem is lack of engagement, and that's what I think the Rohingya wanted to see prior to 2017, desperately wanted to see it in 2017. And now Myanmar, I think the people of Myanmar want to see better engagement from the international community, but they're not getting that, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks for giving us the geopolitics overview. And how would you evaluate the international community's response to Ukrainian refugees in comparison to the Rohingya humanitarian crisis? Also, do you see this as a failure of the R2P, the right to protect clause of the UN?
Well, R2P just didn't work in terms of helping the Rohingya. So the clause just didn't help at all. Arguably, during 2017, the Genocide Convention didn't quite work the way we might have liked either. There's a problem with these things that quite often, because genocide is seen as the crime of crimes, that international actors are prepared to wait until the crimes reach the threshold to be considered genocide before they take action. And of course, by that stage, it's too late. By that stage, things are already underway. So R2P just wasn't enacted. Could have been, and it wasn't. And that's I think a significant problem with R2P, that if it can't be used to protect a victim group like the Rohingya, well, really, when can it be used? Yeah, there's a huge difference in terms of particularly the US and Europe's reaction to the crisis in Ukraine, to what happened in Myanmar in 2021, or what happened with the Rohingya in 2017. Of course, geopolitics plays a role in this. In that there's I think Europe and America, Europe and the US see that they have a self-interest in terms of their engagement with Ukraine, in terms of how they behave, the help that they provided for the Rohingya. I think the problem really was they just didn't see they didn't either see the self-interest in it, which I think is foolish, but also they didn't see the Rohingya as people who were quite like them. I mean, that's got to be talked about, I think. I mean, in terms of the welcoming attitude that many European states have towards Ukrainian refugees, their attitude is very different when it's refugees who are fleeing warfare in other parts of the world, from coming through Syria, coming through Africa, or crisis in Myanmar, yeah, there's unquestionably a religious and racial aspect to that. I mean, unquestionably, and there's a geopolitical aspect as well.
So last year, the military seized complete control of Myanmar, and since then, more than 1,500 people have been killed and several activists have been sentenced to death. How would you link the persecution of the Rohingyas to what is happening right now in Myanmar?
Well, I think one enabled the other. I think that the inaction, both by the international community and by key domestic civilian government figures within Myanmar, I think the inaction to restrain the Myanmar military in 2017, it enabled the military to feel emboldened. They then were confident as to what the international and domestic response might be to a coup. Now, the Myanmar military was, I think, surprised by the resistance that they've encountered to the coup domestically within the country. I mean, I think they were surprised. I think they thought there'd be a couple of weeks of protests and then people would settle down. But the key issue here isn't that they got that wrong and that they didn't properly judge the community attitude. The key issue is that they were so emboldened by getting away with what they did to the Rohingya in 2017 that they thought they could do it again. This time they could just take over the country. And what that shows us is that if you're silent, or if you don't call out genocide or crimes against minorities, like we saw with the Rohingya, that in very short order, those crimes will be on your doorstep. I mean, the fear that we all have really when we look at genocide is, could it happen here? Could it happen where I live? And the message out of Myanmar is that what we saw scorched earth tactics used against Rohingya civilians in 2017. And in 2021 and 2022, that same military is using very similar tactics against civilians now in Myanmar's Buddhist heartland. And the message is that had the military been restrained in 2017, they probably wouldn't have undertaken the coup that they did in 2021.
So what can the US do to help mitigate the Rohingya crisis, and what should future US policy be towards Myanmar?
Well, the Rohingya crisis, I mean, the Rohingya crisis is two elements. One is that you've got a very large population of Rohingya refugees who are in Bangladesh who want to go home when it's safe. When it's safe within Myanmar, they want to go home. And every encounter I've had with Rohingya in the camps in Bangladesh, at some point in the conversation, the question is always, when do you think we can go home? When will it be safe? I mean, there's not a community of people that wants to live anywhere but their ancestral lands, and that's Myanmar. But it's not safe for them to do that. The UN's made very clear that the genocide that they fled, that those conditions still exist within Myanmar. It's still genocidally dangerous for them within Myanmar. There's also a Rohingya population that's stuck in Myanmar, and they're living every day fearful of what the military might do to them. And I mean, it's a perilous situation for that community. But the solution for both involves getting the military out of power within Myanmar. There is no solution for the Rohingya that I can see that involves the military staying in power. I just don't see that being a possibility. While the military is in power in Myanmar, it'll be unsafe for Rohingya in that country, and that means it'll also be unsafe for Rohingya to return to that country. So the US's policy then and other international actors of goodwill who actually care about Myanmar, care about civilians in that country and the Rohingya, have got to be about getting the military out of power. And one of the simple ways to important step would be to institute a global arms embargo, just so the Myanmar military can't keep buying weapons, and that it becomes more difficult for them to buy weapons, even if there are rogue countries that want to sell them weapons, that it becomes more difficult to do that. I think it's important as well for the US to sign up to justice mechanisms like the case at the International Court, the genocide case at the International Court of Justice. I think that would be an important symbolic step, and that would be consistent with the US government view that genocide has been perpetrated against the Rohingya. And I think thirdly, really beefing up the economic sanctions that target Myanmar's military. I mean, they are struggling financially. The economy of Myanmar has all but collapsed since the coup. This is a military that is stretched. It's encountering significant resistance nationwide, and ultimately it needs money to keep doing what it's doing. So more and stronger sanctions that target the military, I think, would be a useful step as well.
So as per your analysis, do you think that one day that the displaced Rohingyas can return to their native Rakhine province, or would they permanently become refugees in neighboring countries?
Well, I hope they can return. I mean, they want to return. Their ancestral lands are in Myanmar. I mean, that's pretty. I mean, the historical record shows that. They're very clear when you speak to Rohingya. They're very clear about where their ancestral lands are. It's Myanmar. They don't want to be somewhere else. They don't want to be an unwilling refugee community somewhere else. They didn't flee Myanmar because they wanted to go to somewhere else for work or for education. They fled Myanmar because they feared for their lives, and that's in many ways the solution for them is both very difficult but also very simple. It's making their ancestral lands safe for them to live on, and that means getting the military out of power within Myanmar. My hope is that will occur. I mean, I think it's not just the Rohingya who want the military out of power within Myanmar. I think most people in Myanmar want the military out of power, and I think that there are efforts, and there is an alternate government of Myanmar, the National Unity Government, and to their credit, they have made efforts to reach out to the Rohingya, and the Rohingya leadership have made efforts to reach out to the National Unity Government. I mean, the Rohingya's history in Myanmar is that they've been part of the national political fabric. They're not a new group within Myanmar. They're people who Myanmar is their ancestral home. They've been part of the national political fabric for much more than they've been excluded, and their solution lies within Myanmar, and I think the solution has to involve getting the military out of power within Myanmar, because while the military is in power, it won't be safe for the Rohingya to return, and it won't be safe for Rohingya who are currently still living within Myanmar.
Okay, so now let's talk about your book ban. Under what law in Myanmar was your acclaimed book on the Rohingya genocide banned from distribution? And how did you react to this news?
Well, it was a surprise. I mean, it's an English language scholarly book, so it's an unusual step by the junta to name check a scholarly book. We should remember they arrested the bookseller and they closed down the bookseller's business. So there's been, they've been victimized immediately by the junta just for offering the book for sale. It's supposedly a banned foreign item, a banned foreign publication. The key issue here, though, is I think that the junta it seems to be proud of the fact that it's banned the book. And this is part of the tactic that they use to encourage people to self-censor. So they've closed down other bookshops within Myanmar for offering what the junta considers sensitive material for sale, but they haven't ordinarily advertised that in the same way as they did with this. This was a story within state media, a publication produced by the Myanmar Ministry of Information, making clear that the book was banned and making clear that the subject matter is what's sensitive here. That the junta do not want people talking about their crimes. They don't want them talking about what they've done to the Rohingya, and they don't want them reading accounts both of the Rohingyas' legitimate history within Myanmar. They don't want them seeing the historical record that shows Rohingya present within Myanmar for time immemorial. They also don't want to hear Rohingya. They don't want people reading Rohingya accounts of what was done to them in 2017, because many of those same tactics that the military used against the Rohingya, they're now using against people in Myanmar's Buddhist heartland. And I think the military doesn't want that connection to be made, that what was done to the Rohingya is now being done in the rest of the country. It's though another sign of the genocide that the junta even bans talking about what has been done to the Rohingya. Again, they're trying to cover up their crimes. They don't want people within the country, within Myanmar, to know what they have done to other Myanmar nationals, what they have done to the Rohingya. And what we would want to see is we want these stories to be available, these accounts to be available to people within Myanmar. I mean, people within Myanmar need to know what was done in their name to the Rohingya, and they also need to know that the military, once it perceives it's dealt with the Rohingya, is of course going to turn that same violence on the majority. And that's something that the military wants to hide from people. But we're seeing it. I mean, you can see it every day when you read the news from Myanmar. You can see what's going on. It's the military's turning that same brutal violence on the majority of the population now, because now they want to stay in power.
So what do you think is the path ahead for Myanmar? What are the possibilities in terms of a change in leadership and democracy coming back? More importantly, what does the persecution of the Rohingya and the failure of democracy, in this case in Myanmar, say about the broader South Asian region?
I think that Myanmar's people don't want the military in power, and they've made that really clear. And they've made clear. I mean, it's been a year and a half since the coup. This is a brutal military dictatorship, yet there is still resistance to their rule, and that shows you the passion that people have to remove the military from power. They've had decades of military rule previous, and they just don't want it back. They simply don't want it back. So I think what that means is that until the military's got out of power, I think we'll see conflict within Myanmar. I don't see the people of Myanmar happily or willfully giving up the fight against the military. And I think that means that until the people win, we will see conflict within Myanmar. Well, until the people will win, or until the military gives up. And that's something that that their leadership may not be willing to do. Although there are significant numbers of defections now from the military, which is a good sign. But until the military is taken out of power within Myanmar, I think we will see conflict and unrest within Myanmar. I mean, what it says for the region, I think, is that the region could do with a more robust regional body that can deal with what we're seeing within Myanmar. I mean, ASEAN hasn't been that body, and this is a challenge for the region to resolve. I mean, in my view, ASEAN hasn't been up to dealing with a domestic security issue within Myanmar that has the potential, well, actually, it already has spread beyond the borders of Myanmar. I mean, there's 1 million plus Rohingya in Bangladesh. There's significant numbers of refugees who have crossed into Thailand as well, and I understand others into parts of India and into China. So it's already spread beyond the borders of Myanmar, but we don't have a regional body that's able to deal with that, and I think that's something that the region, the leadership of the region needs to I think it would be in their interest to remedy, because I don't think it's in anyone's interests for Myanmar to limp along the way it is now. I mean, Myanmar is effectively a failed state. There will be more refugees crossing that border. As the UN says, I mean, 13 million people facing food insecurity. I mean, this is a third of the country facing food insecurity. This is a humanitarian disaster. There's no question that that's what it is. And that's not in anyone's interests within the region, I don't think. I just can't see how it's in anyone's interests for that to be the case, and for there to be a long-term unstable state within Myanmar. I don't see it being in anyone's interest within the region, and it's up to the region's leaders to come up with, I think, a better plan than they've had. They need to beef up, certainly substantially beef up what ASEAN's been prepared to do, and if they're not prepared to do that, then I think they might want to consider some sort of unilateral action to make clear to Myanmar's military that what they're doing within Myanmar is just unacceptable. I mean, it just shouldn't be, they shouldn't be allowed to do what they're doing to ordinary people.
So, Dr. Lee, us at the South Asia Center of the Atlantic Council would like to thank you for, sharing your expertise on the Rohingya crisis and about your book. And we hope more and more people buy it. Please, our audience, it is published by Bloomsbury, and it has a detailed account of Rohingya history and the kind of persecution that they have faced for decades. So please go buy it, and it's also available on Amazon. So order it right away. And I would like to thank the team at the South Asia Center of the Atlantic Council for organizing this webinar, where we had the chance to learn in depth from Dr. Lee about his book. To get updated on the geopolitics of South Asia, we invite all our viewers to check out the South Asia Center's website, which has many commentaries and briefs on the region, as well as yearly and mid-yearly reviews on the different countries of the region. Finally, thanks to our audience based in the US, the UK, South Asia, and around the world for patiently listening to us. Take care and be safe. Bye.